Great. All right. We got a big group already. We are at the top of the hour, and I am going to get rolling. We may have a few people join in. First of all, as I said, thanks for joining us today. Ashley and I were just talking before we started about how much we enjoy these and how great it is to be able to present this and introduce everybody to these great products. So we really appreciate you being here today for the webinar. As hopefully this slide implies, today we're going to take you through the latest release of IMPLAN International. We're going to start by walking through just some of the characteristics, and then we're going to show you how you can put this to work in your own analysis with a little sample analysis. So whether you are already using IMPLAN International or you just are here to explore what it can do, there hopefully will be a lot of useful information for you today. My name is Eric. I am the Director of Education Services here at IMPLAN, and I'm joined today by Ashley Bickel, our International Economic Data Developer. So she is firsthand the expert on where and how all this data gets into IMPLAN. As I mentioned in the introduction, please don't hesitate to ask questions. We really appreciate you all being here, and we appreciate audience participation. So if you have a question, there is a Q&A comment box you should see here. Please drop your questions in there. We'll try to answer those either in the chat itself, or if we can't get to those, we'll try to open it up at the end. And finally, if we don't get to them at all in the webinar, we'll make sure that somebody follows up with you. As I mentioned, we are going to start today with an overview of IMPLAN International. So I'm going to give you a little bit peek at some of the characteristics and important things that you might want to know about the IMPLAN International product. Our objective is to familiarize you with IMPLAN International and hopefully demonstrate some of its usefulness. So we're also going to touch on what's new in the most recent release. And finally, we will wrap it up by putting the data to use in a sample analysis. So, as I said, we're going to start today by looking at some of the key characteristics of IMPLAN International. One of the things I really love about this is that it takes the power of IMPLAN and the power to conduct economic impact analysis and puts it on a global scale. So it really lets you see the big picture across the world, and I really appreciate that. This entire framework is built on reliable data from the OECD. And as an international macroeconomist, that's my background, where I come to IMPLAN with. One of the things that I'm really most impressed with about IMPLAN International is just how comprehensive of a global data set it provides. If any of you have tried to put together, a global data set on your own, you know that it is time consuming. There are often data gaps. There are often issues with compiling and figuring out, units, making everything's consistent. So it's really a tedious process. And one of the biggest values of IMPLAN International is that it's all there for you. Our primary raw data source for doing this is the OECD, and the IMPLAN International data release schedule aligns accordingly with the OECD data releases. But as I just hinted at, the OECD data often has gaps, including gaps in employment and taxes. So there's a whole bunch of other work that goes on in the background to pull data from additional sources like the trade and employment data, the International Labor Organization's modeled and projected estimates, and the OECD Global Revenue Database, World Bank data. As I mentioned, a lot of other reliable data sources go into building this cohesive framework for performing economic impact analysis at a global scale. So with that in mind, let's dig a little bit into some of the specifics, starting with probably the first question you're going to approach when you start an economic impact analysis, which is the question of where. What region are you going to look at? The latest IMPLAN International now covers 80 countries. This is up from 76 in the last release. Together, those 80 countries represent over 90% of the world's GDP. So when you think about that, that's really a powerful scope to be able to work with. To give you another sense of how comprehensive that is, our data set covers every OECD member country, the full European Union, and every economy in the G20. It also covers major trade blocs like the NAFTA countries, the APAC groups, with the exception of Papua New Guinea. So you might be wondering, what about those other countries that aren't in that group of 80? And this is a great question. We also have what we call the global remainder. So that's the aggregate that captures the economic activity of the rest of the world. This is here to ensure that even if your country isn't listed individually, it's still accounted for in the big picture, right? And it ensures a balance in our trade model as well. So we've covered the where, right? Now let's look at the what. As we all know, the geography and the where is the starting point of our analysis. But to understand the economy, we also need to know what it's made of. And this brings me to our second key dimension and characteristics, the industry sectors. If you've used some of our other products, you may be familiar with our industry aggregation for the US, the 528 industries, the 236 for Canada. In our IMPLAN International data, it uses its own unique industry aggregation, which includes 50 functional industries and one additional industry for TOPS, for gathering taxes on products net of subsidies. I'm not going to speak too deeply about TOPS because Ashley's going to talk about that later today. But I do want to mention that while we have these 51 industries for the international product, we also on our support site offer a bridge that helps you map between our other industry aggregations to this 51 industry aggregation for our IMPLAN International product. One of the standout features for me about IMPLAN International is that it allows you to make direct comparisons between countries. Again, as I said, if you've gone to dig up data on your own, you know that sometimes it might be hard to find some apple-to-apple comparisons in the data, but this is all in one place for you in IMPLAN. And there's a few characteristics that let you do that. First, all monetary values are reported in US dollars and reported in basic prices. So this gives us a consistent mechanism to compare cross-country because taxes are accounted for similarly and they're in a similar dollar. This is the only IMPLAN product that supports country-to-country comparison. So you may think, well, why don't I just pull up the IMPLAN Canada and the IMPLAN US and compare across there? There's no direct apple-to-apple comparison there because of the way that taxes are treated and a few other characteristics. So if you want to do country-to-country global comparisons, this is the tool that you need to use. In addition, and this I think goes back to the comprehensiveness of the data set, but for every country, so the data set is complete for all 80 countries in the set. There is output, value added, and employment by industry for all of our countries. So this gives you a really rich tool for apples to apples comparisons about how these global economies look side by side. This same apple-to-apple foundation lets you compare countries side by side, also lets us look what happens when these countries are economically linked to one another using MRIO analysis. So if you've come to IMPLAN or used IMPLAN before, this is maybe a term that you're familiar with, but for those of you that aren't, MRIO analysis is a tool that lets you, as I said, link countries together so you can look at what happens if we have economic activity in one region. What are the spillover effects that are being felt in another region? And what is the feedback between those effects? So it's really a tool for giving you these supply linkages and examining the supply linkages beyond a region boundary. And just another way that you can use IMPLAN International for a more comprehensive economic impact analysis. One very useful feature, which is, I'm highlighting it here as part of IMPLAN International, but it is a part of all of our IMPLAN products, is that there are tools for customizing your analysis. So maybe you sat there when I presented the industries and you thought, well, what if I have, an emerging industry that's not included here? What if, this specific industry aggregation doesn't exactly meet my needs? The customizable, the customization tools in IMPLAN give you a way to address those concerns. You can customize across industries, so you can set up things like specific production functions. You can change spending patterns, so maybe you have insights about how your specific enterprise or industry spends on its intermediate inputs, and you want to adjust that. We're going to see in my hands-on example an example of this, and it's very straightforward and easy to do. And what all of this means is that it just lets you start from this strong foundation that IMPLAN International provides and customize it to something that really completely meets your needs. So with these basics and these characteristics, I'm going to hand it off to Ashley now, who's going to cover a little more in depth what the new features are that have come up with our new release recently.
Thanks so much, Eric. So as Eric mentioned, my name is Ashley, and I am the International Economic Data Developer here at IMPLAN. And my role is not only to produce the data that goes into IMPLAN's international models, but also to continue to develop and expand and enhance our international product offerings. So let's go ahead and move into what is brand new in the latest international data release. So as Eric mentioned, we have expanded our global footprint with 4 brand new countries. These countries include Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sao Tome and Principe, and United Arab Emirates. This expansion is a direct result of the OECD expanding its coverage in its raw input-output tables. So in total, international now covers 80 countries and that global remainder region that Eric mentioned. But a larger map isn't the only change. We also have a more granular industry scheme. So the IMPLAN sectoring scheme has changed from 46 industries to 51 industries. This, again, is due to a change in the number of industries covered by our primary raw data source, the OECD input-output tables. Some of the more notable changes are splitting agriculture, forestry, and hunting into 2 separate. So now we have agriculture and hunting separated from forestry and logging. And the second one that I'd like to highlight is the split of mining and quarrying of these energy producing products. We now have them split into coal and extraction of petroleum and natural gas. One of the major enhancements to the most recent international data is this renewed availability of raw data for the detailed components of value added. So in previous data iterations, the detailed raw data on the components of value added, so this is employee compensation, gross operating surplus, and other taxes on production net of subsidies, this detailed data was just simply not available from the OECD. When we were producing previous data sets, we only received raw data on employee compensation. So that forced our data team into estimating the other 2 components. So we were estimating gross operating surplus and other taxes on production. Now, the latest release does have these detailed components available from our raw data source, and so those have been included. The inclusion of this updated data will primarily be reflected in the tax impact report through OTXS, that other taxes on production net of subsidies. But not only do we have improvements in the tax impact report due to these updated values, but we now have more detailed and accurate labeling in the detailed tax impact report. So this is a little snippet of our detailed tax impact report. And as you can see here, we have a new column in the detailed tax impact report that represents the taxes on products. So we have added a new institution represented by the code 9001 for taxes on products. This improvement more accurately labels the taxes that are paid to government and allows for the separation of taxes paid by industries for engaging in production. So that is OTXS, and the taxes that are paid when a product is produced or sold, which is TOPS. So prior to this release, all TOPS were combined with OTXS and reported as transfers from the type code 8001 or the other taxes on production less subsidies. Now we've split them apart and you can see them separately. All taxes on products are reported as a transfer from our new institution, the TOPS institution. So we now have this TOPS institution, which is great for being able to capture international taxes and more clearly understand what those taxes means. But why was this necessary? So to understand the impetus for these changes, we kind of have to take a step back. So I want to take a moment to provide some context about how and why this is different from the US, and how it relates to the valuation used. In other words, producers or basic prices. So if you are familiar with the US product, you'll know that part of an industry's value added is TOPI, or the taxes on production and imports net of subsidies. So TOPI reflects all taxes paid to the government as a result of engaging in production or sales. Now, if production is valued in basic prices, which is what our international models use, total TOPI can be separated into two separate components. This is taxes on products, net of subsidies, and other taxes on production, net of subsidies. So separated into TOPS and OTXS. So TOPS are taxes paid to government when a product is produced or sold. This includes taxes like value added type taxes, sales taxes, excise taxes, and import duties, among others. OTXS are taxes that are paid to government regardless of production or sales. And these include taxes like land, property, government licensing, taxes on assets, things of that nature. So the key point here is that depending on the valuation used, TOPS is paid or recorded differently. OTXS, however, is always paid out of industry value added, no matter the valuation used. So because our international products, both Canada and the international products, are valued in basic prices, they report OTXS and TOPS separately. Only OTXS is part of an industry's value added, but in the US, all TOPI, all TOPS, and OTXS are paid together out of industry value added. So how is TOPS recorded in international models and what are the implications? So in basic prices, TOPS are recorded separately by the payers of the tax. So both industries and final users or final demand pay TOPS and it's recorded separately in its own row. What this looks like for industries is that TOPS is paid on their purchase of intermediate inputs. So any of the tax that are payable when an industry purchases its intermediate inputs, it's recorded separately in that TOPS row. And importantly, TOPS is directly tied to industry output, to a unit of that industry's output. So that means that if an industry does not produce any output, for example, during a plant closure, no taxes accrue. This is why TOPS is paid out of an industry's intermediate inputs. You can't have taxes if there is no production. In basic prices, final users also pay TOPS. So this is a big distinction. And this reflects the taxes that are payable on goods and services for final consumption. And their taxes on final consumption are also recorded in a separate row. So in producers' prices, TOPS are recorded by the industry that collect and remitted the taxes. So for example, if a consumer purchases goods and services, all of the taxes that the consumer pays is slotted into that one industry where that purchase was made, and it becomes part of that industry's value added. So in many cases, this is a retail industry. That industry, the retail industry, then remits those taxes to the government. So in this case, in producers' prices, the taxes on products are arranged by the industry that collected the taxes. And all production and sales taxes in the entire economy flow through industries. That is much different than the international. So this might sound like academic hair splitting, and your eyes may have glazed over as I was trying to explain all of this, but let's take a look at why this valuation matters for international models. So one of the main reasons is that unlike the US, many countries around the world have a value-added tax system where tax is collected at every stage of production and is passed along the supply chain. So basic prices capture the amount retained by the producer. So when a business buys inputs to make a product, the price they pay may include taxes like VAT that have nothing to do with the actual cost of production. Basic prices strip that transaction down to what the producer actually receives for the goods or services, and those taxes are recorded in a separate row. This keeps those inter-industry transactions clean. It reflects only the producer to producer economic relationship. So in other words, those inter-industry transactions have not been distorted by fiscal or tax policy. So if an input-output table used producers' prices in a country that had value-added tax system, those transactions flowing between industries would be artificially inflated by the tax rates that have nothing to do with the true production cost. So it would distort the data with fiscal policy. Now, using producers' prices is a fine practice for the US. It makes sense that it's used in our IMPLAN 528 scheme because the US does not have a national value added tax system. So that distortion is much smaller, negligible even. So basic prices really are the preferred method of valuation for international models because one, it can be used by all countries, whether or not they have a value-added tax system in place. The second is that it allows for comparison of industry value added across industries. So basically, in the case of producers' prices, all of those taxes on products are slotted into, say, for example, retail industry. That retail industry's value added is going to be quite high relative to other industries. Basic prices also allow for more accurate modeling of production relationships, specifically for those countries that have value-added tax systems. And then again, it allows for comparison across countries. So how is TOPS recorded in IMPLAN? So I've prepared a super simplified graphic to demonstrate how TOPS is being recorded in our international models. We have two holding accounts, the TOPS commodity row and the TOPS industry column. These are highlighted here in orange. Now, because international models are valued in basic prices, TOPS are recorded separately by the payers of the tax. So as we can see here, industries pay taxes on their intermediate purchases via that TOPS account commodity row. And again, as we've talked about before, TOPS is a part of that industry's intermediate inputs. Final consumers also pay TOPS on the goods and services that they purchase, which again occurs via the TOPS account commodity row. Now, to ensure that all of these taxes on products are part of the economy-wide GDP, they are summed up across all of the industries and all of the final demanders and included as part of the TOPS industry's intermediate inputs. So this is our TOPS holding industry account. TOPS, total economy-wide TOPS are then paid out from the TOPS industry to our new TOPS institution. So this is that last row in the graphic, our new 9001 code TOPS. So note here that the TOPS industry is markedly different from all of the other industries. It doesn't purchase any other commodities between our TOPS commodity row. You can see there without all of those not applicable in the first 4 rows. And it also does not pay labor in the form of EC, it doesn't generate profits for gross operating surplus, or it doesn't pay other taxes on production net of subsidies, OTXS. It only pays to our new TOPS institution, 9001. So this these holding sectors are really for accounting purposes. It is to make sure that we are capturing the taxes paid. I also want to highlight that no other industry besides that TOPS industry, Industry 51, pays the TOPS institution that's part of value added. So in that bottom row there, all of those, each industry does not pay to our TOPS institution. From here, as we saw in the detailed tax impact report, this new TOPS institution pays all of the taxes on products net of subsidies to the government. So I want to take a moment to look at what this actually looks like in the application. So if you were to navigate to region details and open the value added balance sheet for any functional industry, here we're looking at a couple of industries in Germany. So if you go to any functional industry like forestry and logging, you'll notice that the taxes on products, or the TOPS row, is exactly 0. That's basic prices at work. The taxes that that industry pays on its intermediate inputs are actually being captured in the TOPS commodity row, or that industry's intermediate inputs, and it's not part of that industry's value added. But to ensure that these taxes are captured in the economy, IMPLAN aggregates all of the transaction taxes across the entire economy and funnels them into a dedicated holding sector, Industry 51. For this special holding account, its total economic output is exactly equal to its value added. So even though if you're looking at, a standard industry balance sheet, it looks like it's missing TOPS, that 408 billion in TOPS isn't missing. It's just been neatly funneled into a single holding account. Now, because these taxes are a part of economy-wide GDP, we have to add these back in. So, as a quick reminder, GDP is the sum of value added across all industries. That's exactly what's being done with this TOPS holding sector. The TOPS that was collected from each industry as part of its II and the TOPS that was collected from each final demander is paid out from this TOPS industry value added. So by including the TOPS industry holding sector, we are adding in those taxes on products that were stripped away from each functional industry's value added. We see this when we look at the economy-wide dashboard for a country like Germany, with a total gross domestic product of nearly $4.1 trillion. So you can see here when that TOPS industry holding account is included with its TOPS line item of about 408 billion, we're adding those taxes back in and accurately measuring total economy-wide GDP. We're also ensuring consistency where GDP is the sum of value added across all industries. So the real takeaway here is that by isolating TOPS into its own sector, IMPLAN International gives you a clean, undistorted view of individual industry supply chains without sacrificing macroeconomic reality. When you run your models, you get the absolute best of both worlds. You get accurate inter-industry relationships and a total value added figure that perfectly equates to economy-wide GDP. So I'm going to pass it back over to Eric now to show you how IMPLAN International can be used in an analysis. Eric, I believe you're still on mute.
Thank you, Ashley. I think the main takeaway for me from all that is that I'm really glad our super smart data team thinks through all of the taxes and implications, so I don't have to do it on my end. So thank you for walking through that with us, Ashley. Like Ashley mentioned, now I want to explore a use case with this international, with IMPLAN International. So let's take a look at what we can do. And I want to point out before I dig into this that this is meant to highlight a sample analysis. By no means it should not be considered a fully formed economic impact report. So I'm pulling some basic figures to set this up. Before we do that, I do want to highlight that if you do have the international product or you are looking to demo it, the starting point is how to access the data. So this is just a quick reminder at how to get to the international data inside IMPLAN. If you have access to US or Canada products, this is especially handy to know. All you need to do is click on create a new project. And as you can see highlighted here, switch to the 51 industries industry set. And this will pull up the international data set for you and let you start a new international product. Okay, with that out of the way, let's put all of this that we've been talking about into action. So I've got a real world scenario coming up that hopefully ties some of these features together and some of the data updates that we covered and helps bring some of this to life. So now that we've covered the data updates and the key features, the practical application I want to look at is something that's been in the news quite a bit. For those of you that aren't familiar, recently in the last 5 years, Apple has moved its iPhone assembly base beyond China, and in particular moved to have a good amount of its assembly done in India. So this has been in the news in a lot of different places. There were a lot of motivations for this, and I'm sure we could have, aside from this, a long business discussion about why, but a few things like disruptions in the supply chain from the pandemic and geopolitical tensions helped drive this. Also, there was some motivation with trade policy, including tariffs and export controls that made this geographical diversification financially attractive. And finally, India offers a combination of large skilled labor forces, and then there were some government incentives in place to help drive this. So that's a little bit of background. And the main point today is not for you to have the ins and outs of this particular scenario, but to get an idea of the potential of what you can use IMPLAN International for. So this chart comes directly from India's Ministry of Commerce and Industry, and it really tells this story about how rapidly Apple's manufacturing presence in India has scaled up. So as you can see over these 4 or 5 years, so from 2022, this is a partial data set here in 2026, you can see that there's been very rapid growth. This is just smartphone exports, so we're not even looking at total production here. So let's move and look a little bit at the specifics of how this is being implemented. This is being done through 5 major assembly facilities led primarily by the Tata Group and Foxconn. These are massive manufacturing facilities. They include on-site dormitories for living, and across these, the most recent numbers that I found recorded was that total employment is approximately 145,000 people. And one of the cool things about this example is that this number in itself gives us enough information to set up an economic impact analysis in IMPLAN. So based just on this 145,000 workers, we can set up an analysis. So starting point here, I've just set up a single region analysis. I've said, okay, I want to look at what's the impact of an industry employment event in computers and electronics in India with 145,000 employees. And you can see here that these numbers tell a pretty powerful story, right? 105 billion in output, 3.7 million in employment. And remember, this is the total economic impact. So this is measuring what happens from those starting point employment, the manufacturing, when we look to consider the indirect effects from the supply chain that's supporting all of this, and the induced effects from the household spending that this activity supports. So as I said, you can see massive impacts. 3.7 million in employment, 14.1 billion in tax revenue. So let's think about where we might want to go next with this. This was a very simple setup, just dropping those employment numbers in. But one of the aspects of India's move to increase iPhone assembly in India, of Apple's move to increase iPhone assembly in India, has been that alongside this, there's this growing domestic ecosystem of component suppliers within India. And this is where the ability to customize our analysis really comes into place. So this building of these domestic ecosystem of component suppliers is an important part of the story, right? India isn't just assembling devices, it's increasing its vertical integration to support that assembly. Where this comes into place in IMPLAN and how we can think about this is if we take a look at this RPC. And what this RPC tells us is what portion of demand for this is coming from the local economy. Right? And here we see that it's set through the region details. I can pull up and look at all this information. And right now it's at 29.53% in IMPLAN. So this is what IMPLAN's using if you just default to its custom settings. Default to its settings. So what if we want to tailor this? We want to see, okay, what is the impact of this increase in component suppliers? So let's suppose, and again, this is all supposing, I've made some big assumptions. Let's suppose that we want to increase this RPC from 29.53%. So this essentially tells us that 30% of demand for electric components in India is currently being met by 30% by domestic suppliers, with the rest being imported. So let's customize this and increase it to 40%. We can do this very easily in IMPLAN. It's very intuitive, and there's a lot of content on the support site to show you how to do this. So what I want to focus on today is what implications does this have? I apologize. So if we look here, we can see that increasing this vertical integration leads to more economic impacts, as we might expect. And why is that? Because we're keeping more of the economic activity inside the region. Now, this was a relatively small jump, right, from 30% to 40%. You can still see there are, non-negligible impacts. We go from 105 billion in output to 107 billion in output. The employment goes from 3.6 million to 3.7 million. So you can see they're small percentage wise, but the point here isn't what is the exact impact. The point here is the ease at which we can customize this analysis to integrate specific information that we have about our enterprise and about our situation. So let's take this one step further, right? And let's think about globalizing this analysis a little bit. So far, everything I've looked at has just been focused on what's happening inside India. But as we know, in a global economy like we have today, nothing like this happens in isolation. So when manufacturing moves to India, it's coming from somewhere else. And in this case, that's primarily China. So for the next step, we're going to assume that the increase in employment in India corresponds to an equal reduction in employment in China. Again, this is an assumption, though I will tell you it's driven some by what I could find in the news. So taking this step is really going to highlight where IMPLAN's international MRIO capabilities come into play. So we're not just looking at one country anymore. We're going to globalize this. Specifically, we're going to look at China, and I'm also going to add in the rest of the APAC countries. So we're going to have two countries that have events in them, China having a decrease in employment, India having an increase in employment in this sector. And then we're also going to see what are the implications on this rest of APAC region, even though it doesn't have any of these events occurring in it. So I want to highlight, rather than walk through all of the results, another aspect that IMPLAN International provides, which is in my previous results, we looked just at overall impacts, what I like to think of as kind of the big four, the big economic impact indicators. But just like IMPLAN provides detailed economic data on regions, it also provides very detailed information about your impact results. One of these being industry level results. So what I've pulled up here is just a visualization of what are these supply chain ripple effects across other APEC countries. And you can see this is nice information to be able to fall back on. So we can think of one, what's occurring in the country where these events are happening. So we started by looking just at India. Then we can say, okay, what if I need to make some customizations, which we did through the RPC to account for more domestic vertical integration. And now we've expanded this to say, okay, we don't want to look at this country in isolation. We want to think about the global ramifications of this. And we did that by linking India, China, and APEC. In addition, we can add so much detail to our analysis through the results. We can understand really what's driving these results by looking at detailed industry impacts as well. So here we see that, the top industry or sector where these results are rippling through APEC countries is through wholesale and retail trade. Second is computer and electronics. So still internationally supplied, which makes sense because we set the RPC just to 40%. So some of these components through the computer and electronic industry are still coming from international countries. Okay. So I want to wrap this up with just a couple key takeaways before we open this up for Q&A. First, as I've hopefully highlighted and you've seen, IMPLAN International lets you conduct global economic impact analysis with confidence. You can look across 80 countries, and these countries span 90% of the global GDP. They are all backed by reliable data sources that have been checked and compiled to account for missing data. And as Ashley showed us, detailed consideration of handling international tax structure. We can look at complex cross-border supply chain relationships using MRIO. You can tailor this analysis to your specific footprint. It's easy to customize to match specific industries, to customize regions. There's a lot of flexibility to capture the nuances of your specific project. Clear tax impacts. Not only have these been very vetted and accounted for methodologically, but they are clearly reported and transparent for you. And finally, this is a major comprehensive global data set. You can gain insight into economic ecosystems with a data suite that covers everything from industry level production and demand, commodity trade flows, to industry multipliers. So hopefully what you take away from this just is the potential of IMPLAN International. And I hope that it's inspired you. If it has, and if you're curious about learning more, I recommend that you reach out for a personalized demo. If you don't already have access to IMPLAN International, you can schedule that through implan.com/demo request or email our sales at implan.com. This will let you explore exactly what data is included. You can set up toy examples, and you'll have support doing that. If you're a current customer or just want to explore some of our resources available, I suggest that you check out our support at implan.com. This is our comprehensive support site. And you can email support at implan.com as well. My apologies. The support site is support.implan.com. Thank you so much. And finally, we want to open it up if anybody has any questions today. We are a little bit over time, so if you do not have time to stick around with us today and you want to ask questions, please don't hesitate to email through that support@email.com or that sales support@implan.com or that sales@implan.com that I brought up.
We did have a couple of questions come in. The first was whether this recording would be made available, and yes, it will be made available to all attendees, and it will also be available on our support site.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ashley. And I see another question about pricing by region. And I would say if you're interested in pricing by region, please reach out to our sales team. They'll be able to give you any information about pricing.
We were also asked a question about the underlying assumptions for the values estimated in the analysis. And so, for example, they were asking about the 29% RPC. So that is actually developed from the raw data from the OECD. So we have trade by country to country trade values that are provided through the OECD intercountry input-output tables. And that's where that data is sourced from.
Thank you, Ashley. And then as well, I would highlight that if you ever want more information about data methodology, data sources, or just the assumptions built into the IMPLAN IO model, the support site has very detailed information about all of that you can follow up with. All right. As I've said, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here and spending time with us. Feel free to explore and see what more we have to offer at support.implan.com. And I hope that we hear from you in the future.
Thank you.